Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the week 12 lecture. So I'll try to finish up relatively quickly. I think we're finished with ethnic studies. So let's move on to the final part of the chapter where they talk about postmodernism and pop culture. I think they could have used a little bit of a better transition into this final section. They kind of just jump right into it. It doesn't seem to logically follow all of the ethnic studies stuff. But the way you should understand their discussion of modernism and postmodernism is they're now talking about literary periods. They're kind of shifting gears, and now we're talking about literary eras or sort of periods of development, might be how you think about it, literary movements. So I guess this makes sense why they're putting it in this chapter, because they want to talk about popular culture, because cultural studies is very interested in popular culture, and cultural studies owes a lot to postmodernism. So they want to bring in postmodernism. But first, in order to understand the sort of movement or period of postmodernism, we have to understand modernism. And really, to understand modernism, you kind of have to understand a little bit of what came before. So if you remember back in part one, we were talking about some of these sort of standard humanistic values about sort of universal truth and how literary value is universal. The best books have universal value that can be appreciated by anyone. And human nature doesn't really change, and these certain beliefs and sort of, we might call them sort of old-fashioned beliefs that were often associated with the Victorian era. Again, kind of the moral approach to literature, the idea that lit should provide some kind of moral instruction. And these sort of Victorian values that really dominated the 19th century. Modernism, which comes along at the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, kind of rejects a lot of that stuff. It rejects this idea of kind of universal truth and all this sort of moral instruction. So modernism is largely kind of brought on, many think or claim, it's kind of brought on by the disillusionment of World War I, really kind of helps to accelerate the movement. And modernist writers, we're talking about Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, Hemingway, right? They're very interested in kind of a different approach to truth. They don't necessarily believe that there is no truth, but like cultural critics that come later, they think that truth can best be understood subjectively. So they're not so much looking for that universal value, that universal truth. Instead, they're looking at subjective impressions. They're looking at subjective impressions of reality instead of chasing that one true vision of reality. They're very interested in experimentation. They want to experiment with point of view and time and space. And they use oftentimes sort of a stream of consciousness narrative style, although not all modernists do that. But, Joyce and Faulkner do, and Woolf does. So they're kind of blowing up some of the old realistic traditions. If you guys know about realism as kind of a style of writing, it was very dominant in the 19th century. This idea that we're trying to capture reality as it is, and we're trying to convey truth and moral instruction. The modernists rejected a lot of that, found a lot of that boring, and were more interested in experimentation, fragmentation, ambiguity. Not everything is clear. Not everything has inherent value. And again, there was a sense of sort of disillusionment, like a lot of our previously held beliefs maybe were falling away, a certain jaded quality, cynicism. But, and this is kind of what's tricky about modernism, they're not completely dismissing all of those old kind of humanistic or almost Victorian values. They're not completely rejecting all of that. And they still kind of buy in, many of them, to the idea that art can provide meaning. and coherence. And for the modernists, art really kind of needs to do that, because for them, religion doesn't have the same importance that it used to have in older societies. You know, a lot of those old institutions that we maybe believed in, the family, the church, the school, the military, those institutions weren't as effective anymore. We didn't have an aristocracy. We didn't have as many institutions or entities that could create meaning and enforce meaning as the world becomes more modern and more secular and things are changing faster and faster. So for a lot of the modernists, art can provide meaning. Art can provide direction and coherence and some form of truth, even though it might be difficult to find. So the modernists, like I said, they kind of rise up at the end of the 1800s. They really hit their stride right after World War I, during that period between World War I and the Second World War. So in the 19-teens, the 1920s, all the way up until World War II in the 1940s. And then what comes after the modernists is the postmodernists. So the postmodernists, like the modernists, reject a lot of these old-fashioned notions about truth and reason and identity and objectivity. They reject kind of a lot of those big master discourses, those most kind of popular discourses, the master narratives that we tell ourselves, the grand narratives that any culture or society kind of keeps in circulation. They might not be accurate, but they're stories that we want to believe. And I think in America, we certainly have a lot of those. We can decide for ourselves what might fall under the category of grand narratives that postmodernists would say, yeah, we don't need that. We don't think that history unfolds that way. We don't think that there's one true, progression of history. They reject the idea that we necessarily get better with time. They sort of reject the whole idea of like the forward sort of progressive march of civilization. They don't necessarily think that's always the case. So they're doing a lot of the same stuff that the modernists do, but they're kind of taking it to taking it to the next level. So they're skeptical of a lot of the same things that the modernists are skeptical of. But the modernists still kind of had a certain faithfulness to literary form. So a lot of modernists would still sort of stick to certain classic principles or sort of structural principles of the novel or of poetry, right? They were expressing sort of new ideas, and a lot of their techniques were a bit new. Again, stream of consciousness, a certain fragmentation to a lot of their narratives, but there was still this kind of, again, this underlying belief that art could still provide meaning. So they weren't blowing everything up. Postmodernists don't really think that art needs to deliver coherence or a clear meaning. Again, they reject the idea of universal progress. So there's a lot more playfulness with postmodernism. I wouldn't say everything's a joke, but they don't even necessarily take in the novel, they're not even really regarding the form of the novel as something that has inherent value or importance. So in a postmodern novel, they're kind of commenting on the fact that they're writing a novel. Like that's part of it. They're self-referential. This is sometimes referred to as metafiction. Fiction that's sort of about fiction. It's about its own status as fiction. So a lot of postmodern writers want to kind of expose the artificiality of a lot of our literary forms. They want to call attention to it. Even a lot of the modernists didn't always want to directly address the audience or call attention to the sort of, artificial nature of their fiction. They might have been writing in different ways and they were expressing some more modern ideas, but they still wanted that facade. They still kind of wanted to use the form in a pretty faithful way to connect to audiences in kind of the same basic traditional ways, but maybe just to convey slightly different different themes and different kinds of characters, different kinds of perceptions. But postmodernists really want to sort of expose, like I said, the artificiality. They want to play with form. They want to kind of have fun with it. Parody is a big part of the postmodern experience. Parody and pastiche, sort of taking existing forms, using them, but also kind of commenting on them and sort of calling attention to them as artistic forms, and almost questioning them at times, undermining them at times, reminding the audience that this is just a book, right? That this is all made up, that I'm following certain conventions, that all novel writers are supposed to follow, right? Having fun with some of those conventions, kind of, turning them on their head or simply calling attention to them. So some famous, postmodern writers that you might be familiar with. Thomas Pynchon was pretty big in sort of the mid 20th century. David Foster Wallace, John Barth. But, this term gets applied to a lot of more contemporary writers and artists. So, the films of Quentin Tarantino are often referred to as postmodern because he's very meta. Right? Tarantino comments on other movies. And you notice if you watch Tarantino movies, if you're familiar with his work, he's not really trying to be realistic. And again, postmodernism's not really about realism the way that older forms of literature were, even in the way that a lot of modernism was. Even though modernism didn't have the same relationship to realism, a lot of modernist texts seem realistic when put in comparison to postmodern texts, because postmodern writers aren't really interested in trying to reproduce reality. And if you watch Tarantino's movies, you wouldn't really say that they're realistic. Like, what Tarantino draws on in his fictive universe is other movies. So his fictive universe is almost completely comprised of other movies and other pop culture creations. So that's kind of postmodern. Right? There's no getting out of the movies. Like he's not trying to get at real life. His whole thing is he's collecting. This is kind of what pastiche is. You kind of are bringing together a lot of different forms, but you're kind of having fun with them. You might not always be taking all of the forms or genres seriously. Again, there's an element of fun or play or parody. But we use this term in increasingly broad ways. So again, we're kind of getting away from the textbook definition that I gave you, and now postmodernism can often refer to a lot of recent kind of contemporary artistic forms. A lot of stuff that we see on social media. Again, it's self-referential. It refers to other art, it's not so much referring to reality. And that's what art was supposed to do in previous eras. But in postmodernism, you're just referring to other texts. You can't get outside of the texts. There's always texts. And they're kind of reveling in that. They're almost kind of having fun with it, and they want their audience to see it. So sometimes Kurt Vonnegut is considered a postmodern author. I'm a little bit on the fence with that. But yeah, Vonnegut's playful. Vonnegut uses science fiction, fantasy genres, but he also kind of has fun with them. There is an element of parody to his work, but also postmodernists are just continuing to question the old-fashioned standards and ideals that we're still kind of supposed to be upholding even in the mid to late 20th century. So again, they're kind of rejecting a lot of those old-fashioned humanistic values and standards, just like the modernists were, but the postmodernists are just doing it even more. But there's also a train of thought, and they don't really get into this in the book, but I just want to point it out because I do want to talk about Frederick Jameson and his theory of these literary movements, because a lot of critics and scholars think that we put too much stock in these designations, these historical literary periods, the distinctions between modernism and postmodernism, right? Is Vonnegut a modernist or is he a postmodernist? I don't know. Does it matter? and I think there's debate as to how much these distinctions matter. So Frederick Jameson, who we've mentioned before, he's a pretty well-known American Marxist critic, he has a theory that these literary movements are really just byproducts of capitalism. He claims that they're just driven by power dynamics and capitalism. They don't really have artistic meaning. They're just kind of byproducts of what's going on in the larger society in terms of economics, power, political power. So he says back in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had realism, because that fit in with the early stage of market capitalism that we were in back in those centuries. So that was the Industrial Revolution. That was kind of the beginning of modern market capitalism. So we have rapid technological advancements. Life is changing. The world is changing. So there's kind of value to the realistic depiction of some of that change. So realistic fiction, realistic novels can kind of provide that as we have all of these technological advancements and we kind of transition into a more modern society. Okay, fine. Then the second stage is modernism. So that starts at the tail end of the 19th century into the first half of the 20th. And Jameson says, well, that's the next stage of capitalism. So modernism is brought about by sort of this slightly more advanced stage of market capitalism that's kind of defined by the rise of like big monopolies in America and like electricity and the rise of the car. And I think he's onto something just from a historical standpoint, because he is tracking real historical developments and kind of pairing them with the literary movement. So modernism comes about as we have more advancement, sort of capitalism now practiced on a bigger scale, and again, more social changes, but we also have world wars. We have huge upheaval. We have suffering and death on a large scale. So the modernists are a bit disillusioned, and they're responding to even more sort of advanced developments of capitalism that are making things kind of weird and a little bit destabilized. And then we move into our third period, which is postmodernism, coming after World War II. And this is an era that we're still in, according to Jameson. This is an era of capitalism defined by global consumer capitalism and the expansion of digital communication. And of course, we all know a little bit about that. So the idea now, this fits with postmodernism, because now everything is fractured, right? So we've really lost some idea of universal truth. And again, we can appreciate that idea even without thinking about literature, right? Do we really, in America right now, is there one objective truth that all Americans subscribe to? I mean, that's never truly existed, because everybody's always had different opinions. But I would argue, and many do, that with the explosion of social media, all these different media sources, we have a more fragmented sort of collective experience now. Everybody kind of, we don't share as many objective truths. We don't have as many shared standards, shared values. We don't really have a shared reality anymore. And Jameson would say, back in the 19th century, we kind of did. Back in the early 20th century, about 100 years ago, we still kind of did. Now, we don't. So the literary movement that fits our present moment, which is all about the individual. Oftentimes we have art that's just about other art. Everything's fragmented. Nothing's really shared or universal. So it's the perfect time for postmodern art. And postmodernism is also very much influenced by post-structuralism, which we also call that deconstructivism. So this idea that meaning is kind of arbitrary. There's no one set meaning. Meaning is always changing. So remember, we said the feminists were influenced by the deconstructivists, again, because they bought into the idea that identity changes just like meaning changes, and there's a lot of different possible meanings available. Not that one universal meaning that some of those old-fashioned humanists some of those humanists might have believed in. So again, I don't know that we have to subscribe to these distinctions all that much, but just be aware of kind of who the modernists were, and just be aware of some differences between modernists and postmodernists. And again, continue to kind of think about our present moment as a postmodern time. And again, just kind of thinking about some of those characteristics of postmodernism that I mentioned. And we'll do this this week as an exercise to kind of see how postmodernism functions in society, in our culture today. And then the final thing I want to leave you with is just the very last thing they get to in the chapter: popular culture analysis. And as they say, this doesn't really get started until like the 1960s, because for a long time up until then, pop culture or low culture was held to be kind of beneath the interest or concerns of scholars and critics. But now, as we get rid of those distinctions between high and low, we notice that popular culture has a lot to tell us. There's a lot of artistry happening in pop culture, and there's a lot we can learn about the culture at large. So again, we don't have to just focus on the texts. Cultural studies and pop culture studies, which was really, pop culture studies is a subgenre of cultural studies, I would say. But again, we're not just looking at texts, we're looking at production. We're looking at other aspects. So these approaches transcend literary study. They transcend English. That's partly, why they're valuable. So in the book, they mention 4 sort of different types of pop culture analysis. You can have production analysis, which is very much focused on who created the text, who owns the media even. So you can look at authors and directors and showrunners and artists, but also we can think about who owns the publishing companies, who owns the studios, who owns the platforms that these artists need in order to get their vision, to get their expression out there to the public. There's also textual analysis, which is what it sounds like. It's the study of the actual cultural text and how the text creates meaning. But again, this could be anything: a movie, a show, a comic, something online. There's really no limit. Graffiti that we find on, buildings outside. We don't have to limit ourselves to literature. The third kind is audience study or audience analysis, which I think is interesting, right? How do different groups determine meaning? How do audiences consume these texts? How do they understand them? How do they talk about them? That's always interesting to consider. And then finally, historical analysis, just kind of noticing how all of these things change through time. But I think we can really just consider pop culture analysis. It's even broader than just those 4 kind of types. And I think typically, people still mostly do the textual analysis. We're still mostly analyzing the shows, the movies, the comics, the songs. But just notice how much of this gets done now. I just wanted to call attention to that. I just think we can consider pop culture study to be simply taking pop culture seriously, which is done with increasing frequency today. So just go onto a website, any kind of like culture website or even a news website. You're going to find analysis of pop culture products, popular songs, popular TV shows. You can't see, but I'm gesturing towards my own TV. Popular TV shows, popular movies, and popular fiction. Popular novels, not necessarily the kind of novels that would have been thought of as high art, but we're talking, like Stephen King or, J.K. Rowling, popular authors who are accessible to just about anybody. So notice how much those kinds of texts get analyzed now in sort of popular venues, like I said, popular websites. This is not academic work. This is not only happening at colleges and universities. It's not only being done by people like me. We have cultural critics now, journalists, bloggers, podcast people, right? We have people who analyze these true crime, these murder shows about true crime, right? That's very much a pop culture product. You have a whole show, you have entire podcasts devoted to The Bachelor, analyzing The Bachelor, analyzing each episode of The Bachelor. They don't just have like one show, they have a weekly show. When the show's on, when the actual Bachelor's on the air, they break down every single episode. They have callers. They're really doing close reading. They're doing analysis. They're doing literary analysis for texts that we might not think of as literature, but it's the same work. It's the same work that we've been doing in our critical responses and our big essay so far. So just take a look, and it would be great to find some examples of pop culture analysis because it's everywhere. It's become mainstream. And 50, 60 years ago, it was not. So that's it. I'm tired. I'm going to go and watch something on my TV now, some pop culture product that is probably analyzed in some corner of the internet. So that's it for cultural studies. We're just spending 1 week on it. So let me know if you have any questions about this week's material, and I'll see you next week.